The world's biggest cities are shutting down.
We have military and policemen closing up the streets, so we cannot leave this area.
A lockdown will be the biggest disruption to daily life many of us will ever experience.
Hello and welcome once again to the Nexus. Like millions of you around the world, the Nexus team is still living and working in lockdown. Now, it can be lonely, it can be tedious, but we have to remember this is still the best way to beat COVID-19, that and along with testing. And that for some people, including these millions of migrant workers in India, life is hanging by a thread. We'll have an update from New Delhi in a moment. We'll also be getting tips on how to handle isolation from a retired NASA astronaut, Clayton Anderson. He lived in space with just a couple of people in the space station for some 167 days. We'll also be comparing lockdown living spaces. It's all right for some, but what if you don't live in a castle? But first, let's get the big picture from around the globe and a quick look at a world in lockdown.
More than 3 billion people in almost 70 countries and territories have been asked to stay at home. A quarter of the world's population is now living under some form of lockdown due to coronavirus.
A lockdown will be the biggest disruption to daily life many of us will ever experience.
Italy is on total lockdown.
If anybody wants an idea of what the future may hold, a worst-case scenario, don't look any further than Italy.
The Spanish government looks set to impose a 15-day nationwide lockdown.
France is just hours away from a nationwide lockdown.
Colombia's president has ordered the country into lockdown.
A 2-week lockdown in Bavaria.
In Istanbul, the city's really been shutting down.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson put the UK on lockdown today.
It's vital to slow the spread of the disease.
New Zealand has just entered an unprecedented lockdown.
We have always said we would act early, decisively, and go hard.
India has become the latest and largest country to introduce a nationwide lockdown in the fight against the coronavirus. Its population of 1.3 billion has been told to stay at home.
Those with homes can stay home, but we are seeing homeless shelters at the moment inundated.
Human rights groups say India's lockdown has disproportionately affected migrant and daily wage workers.
More than 56 million South Africans dealing with a new reality, the challenge of a 3-week lockdown to combat the coronavirus.
During the lockdown, the wealthy will retreat to their luxury homes while the poor remain crammed in townships like this one.
We're talking about the mass quarantine. Could something like that happen here in the U.S.?
I think it's definitely possible.
California's streets empty, as nearly 40 million people in that state are sequestered, closely followed by a similar order in New York. But a nationwide lockdown is not being considered.
Right now we're implementing restrictions on a statewide basis.
China is set to lift lockdown measures on Wuhan in just over 2 weeks.
The date is April 8th. This means people will now be allowed to leave the city, leave Hubei province, leave the original epicenter of this outbreak.
So roughly a quarter of the world's population living in lockdown, and half of them in just one country, India. 1.3 billion people are in their second week of a 3-week lockdown. Some are being dealt with rather harshly if they break the rules, and sometimes even if they have a right to be out, like people delivering food. Let's go straight to New Delhi now, and we have Neha Punia joining us. She's a journalist out there in the Indian capital. Neha, we can get into the minutiae of the lockdown itself in a moment, but first, explain to me, why are people being beaten with sticks, sometimes even when they are not breaking the rules?
This is the world's strictest, most complete lockdown with 1.3 billion people mostly indoors. And when the Prime Minister announced it last week, he tasked the police force with implementing it, giving them powers to arrest and detain people They can jail people from anywhere between 2 months to 6 years if they are found flouting this lockdown. But in the days that followed the lockdown announcement, there was considerable confusion on the ground. Many police officers accused of being overzealous, of using force to punish people who were out even to buy things like groceries or medicines. There were several videos doing the rounds of people being caned. In many instances, you even had these police officers stopping delivery trucks from entering cities like Delhi and delivering food and medicines. And that led to a lot of criticism. In India, it's not uncommon to see police forces using canes to try and implement law and order. Most of these officers on the roads aren't armed. This is the first use of force they see before they detain or arrest anyone. But in an unprecedented national calamity like this, many have called out the government for not telling these police officers that people who are out and about getting their groceries or going to the hospital should not be punished. And the government had to eventually come out with a clarification saying that it acknowledges there was excessive force used by the police in many instances and that the police force has now been sensitized.
I wonder how much of this is down to how Prime Minister Modi and his government has handled it right from the beginning, just giving people 4 hours notice, barely. Let's have a listen to him from when he made the announcement on March the 25th.
पूरे देश में आज रात 12 बजे से संपूर्ण देश में संपूर्ण लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है.
So Neha, it was very sudden for these millions of Indians who had this announcement all of a sudden. And I hear that the rules of the lockdown, even after the announcement, were not really explained. Is that right?
When Prime Minister Modi spoke, he made an emotional appeal to Indians to try and stay indoors for the next 21 days, saying that if all 1.3 billion Indians didn't do that, they would set the country back by 21 years. But his speech didn't quite mention whether essential services would be exempt from this. He did say that there would be no shortage of food supplies or medicines in the country, that his government would ensure that that didn't happen. But he didn't say that you could still go out and buy groceries, that you could still go to hospitals, you could still go buy medicines. And there was considerable panic on the ground. It was 8 p.m. local time, and soon after he finished talking, people were queuing up outside grocery stores to stock up for 3 weeks. And he later had to tweet to say, don't panic, you can still go out to get essential things.
I think people, human rights groups and others are incredibly worried about the millions of workers who come from rural areas to the cities. When the city closes down, as it has, they just want to get home. They have no money, they have nowhere decent to live. They're trying to get home back to their villages to at least have some family around, to have some dignity in their own surroundings while they still have very little to live on. And those people, we've seen the pictures. In some instances, they're being sprayed on the side of the road with disinfectant and so on. Can you tell me a bit more about these people and why they seem to have so little rights in India?
When Prime Minister Modi announced that lockdown last week, just like everyone else, these migrant laborers were also caught completely unawares. When the lockdown kicked in, they were suddenly out of jobs. They had no money to pay their rent or buy food, which is why the only thing they could do was go back home. But in this instance, they also couldn't take any kind of transport because all rail, road and air transport was suspended as well, which is why thousands of migrants had to walk on foot for unimaginable distances to try and get back to their villages. There was a lot of criticism given to the government over this, which is why the government had to hastily organize buses for them over this weekend to try and take them back home. But in that case, social distancing was completely thrown out of the window. You had hundreds of people sitting in crammed buses right next to each other, and the worry is they've possibly taken this virus back to their hometowns, to rural India, where healthcare facilities aren't that great. And many officers have also been spraying these migrants down with disinfectant, and the government has now said that that was wrong, that these were just overzealous officers who didn't understand what needed to be sanitized, that seats and buses that these migrants traveled on should have been cleaned and not these people themselves. And those pictures have been heartbreaking, especially when you compare that to how the urban rich have been treated versus the poor of the country.
Well, Neha, that's exactly the point, isn't it? You have the federal government again blaming, inverted commas, overzealous local police officers, but they need to set the example in a country where you have an expensive space program, you have Bollywood, the Shah Rukh Khan is the highest paid actor in the world with $600 million fortune, and still there are people like these migrant workers who are suffering and being treated no better than animals, being sprayed with disinfectant. You just, on a last question, why is this still tolerated in India?
In a lot of these instances, the poor don't really have a voice. For example, many of these migrant laborers who travel back to their hometowns, they're all employed in informal jobs. They make up 90% of the country's workforce, and they usually travel to cities like Delhi and Mumbai to find sources of employment. But there is a very clear hierarchy of power in India. When police officers speak to the poor, they usually don't have much avenues to push back, which is why this treatment is often tolerated, but it is being criticized by many in the country today.
Neha Punia, thank you very much for that summing up from New Delhi. Really appreciate it. And remember, later in the program, we're going to be getting some self-isolation tips from a retired NASA astronaut, Clayton Anderson. He spent 167 days in space, much of that at the International Space Station. He's now a motivational speaker, and hopefully he'll be able to motivate you during these trying times. Now, we've looked at India. It might be the world's biggest lockdown, but it's far from the only one. Here's a map showing all the countries which are currently in some form of lockdown at the time of recording, something in the region of 82. Of course, the lockdowns range in strictness from country to country. In Italy, which has had by far the most deaths, people are only allowed to leave their houses for urgent, verifiable work, family emergencies or health reasons. In the UK, by contrast, children of key workers are still allowed to go to school. People are allowed to go outside to exercise once a day and to travel to and from work if you can't work from home. And not only do lockdowns vary in severity, depending on which country you live in, it also depends on what kind of home you have. It is surely easier to self-isolate if you have a big home, like some people I can think of.
Plenty of rich and powerful people have been infected by COVID-19. The UK's future king, Prince Charles, the UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He was the first world leader to catch it, but maybe not the last. The wives of Spain and Canada's prime ministers have it too. And then there's a plethora of celebrities. Tom Hanks, Placido Domingo, Olga Kurylenko, and basketball player Rudy Gobert. This little joke cost him dearly. He came down with the virus 3 days later.
I wish I would have took this thing more seriously.
Like millions of us, they all self-isolated. But unlike millions of us, some of them live in a castle, making lockdown quite a bit easier. The Prince's Scottish getaway, Balmoral, has 52 bedrooms, so he's unlikely to feel claustrophobic. Compare that to the average UK home, which has more like 2 or 3 bedrooms spread over just 85 square metres. Or smaller still in India, where the average home is just 45 square metres, close to China's average of just 43 square metres. At the other end of the scale, American houses are big. Not Balmoral big, but on average 130 square metres. And of course, the number of people living in each home matters too. So it's pretty tough in crowded India, where around 1 in 3 people live in less space afforded to convicts in American prison cells. And that's not something the rich and powerful have to worry about, unless of course you include Harvey Weinstein.
We're going to get another perspective now from Clayton Anderson. He's a retired NASA astronaut. Clayton Anderson, a great privilege and an honour for us to welcome an astronaut or a retired astronaut to the Nexus for the first time. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, sir.
You served 167 days in space, most of that time in the International Space Station. You're now a motivational speaker and an author. A lot of people in the media will try to make comparisons between your time out there, just 2 or 3 of you up in the space station, and their time in lockdown or self-isolation on Earth. Do you tell me, does the comparison stack up in any way?
Sure, there are always some things that match. For example, I lived in space for 5 months with two gentlemen from Russia, two Russian cosmonauts. And the thing that most people want to know about is, what did we do? How did we keep ourselves busy? And that's the trick, basically, if there is a trick, is to have a schedule, stick to that schedule, and try to come up with new things within that schedule to make it new and different, since you feel like you're doing everything over and over and over again.
And presumably you have to have some sort of preliminary training to kind of get you ready for living up there with just a couple of other guys and away from your family. And in this circumstances, many families find themselves split up.
We had a lot of training, yes, but most of that was technical training on how we were going to live and work on board the station. The aspect of the psychological training that many people on Earth are undergoing today with the virus is a little bit different, but they can take lessons learned from us and maybe make their situation better. For example, staying with a schedule every day and trying to find ways to put new and unique things in that schedule to keep the interest up. And finally, make sure that those things include physical exercise for both the body and the mind.
And what about the feeling of claustrophobia, of confinement? I don't know how big the International Space Station is, the living quarters for you. Perhaps you could expand on that. Just tell us how you deal with that.
When I lived in space, the living quarters, the station was about the size of a 3-bedroom house. We had a small area to prepare meals, and then we had a small single bathroom. So for 3 people, it was very manageable. The issue is you can't really get outside, right? You can't go out and smell the air and feel the breeze and see the sunshine. So we had to find ways to distance ourselves when we needed a little private time, or figure out how we can get our work done a little faster so we might have a chance to look out the window, or to answer emails, or to make telephone calls. We had some capability to communicate with the folks on Earth.
And just like, you know, people living in a small house, you're going to be bumping into the same people over and over again for days, weeks, months. How do you handle those relationships to make sure they don't break down?
Communication is always very important. And I think that patience is another virtue we have to have. There are going to be times when people do things that are irritating to you, or that are not necessarily the way you might do them. And so at that point, you have to kind of look beyond those single issues and kind of see the big picture. Hey, we are here together for a period of time, and we have to survive this together and depend on one another. And so little things, you have to be willing to let those go. And if they become irritants such that they're still bothering you, it's time to have a frank discussion and clear the air a little bit so that everybody understands where everyone is coming from. So communication and patience are 2 keys that you need.
It is easier if you have a big place, or if you have a big garden, you have somewhere to go. Obviously, you didn't have much of a garden up there, but you did have a wonderful view. Is that something you ever get tired of?
Personally, I didn't really get tired of the view unless we were sailing over the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. The oceans are pretty big, and even from space can be kind of dull. But typically, if you picked a time to sail down to the window and look out and see the Earth, it was very peaceful for me. It was calming for me. It was exciting, even just to watch cloud formations. So, you know, people have to be creative when they don't have, or everybody has something. So maybe it is a big window you can look out and just watch the neighborhood, or watch the people that are out, or the animals that are out. You know, think of creative ways to change your paradigm for a situation like this.
And of course, if you were still up in the International Space Station, you would be looking down on a world right now dealing with one of the biggest crises that anyone can ever remember, and hopefully working together. Clayton Anderson, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus. We're going to move on now to looking at the whole purpose of these lockdowns, the attempt to flatten the curve. What exactly does that mean? Take a look.
Here is why it works. This model from the University of Sydney shows the spread of COVID-19 if only 70% of Australians practice strict social distancing. In short, the virus will continue to spread. But have a look at what happens if 80% stay home. And now 90%. With strict social distancing, 3 months is all it could take to get the virus under control.
Let's bring in our final guest now, Dr. Eric Fagelding. Dr. Fagelding, thank you for joining us once again on the Nexus. Now, we just heard in that soundbite that it's all about flattening the curve, and that possibly even with strict measures, 3 months could turn it around in Australia. What do you consider to be the right level of lockdown measures, because they do vary around the world, and over what period of time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and many people are concerned, and for good reason. At the same time, we have to realize that the lockdown measures are a mitigation measure, as in they will mitigate and slow it down, but it cannot put out the fire. To put out a fire, you need aggressive testing, and not just testing at hospitals, but frontier testing, as I call it, of the epidemic as people get sick. And we're developing new tests that are 5 minutes long. We're also developing serology tests that test your blood serum for antibodies to the virus. And that means potentially we can actually tell if people have immunity. So as we are more aggressive testing with these high-speed tests, and we're aggressive in finding who they were in contact with, and find out these who are immune, we can then slowly reopen business. Because until we have this aggressive testing in place, all the mitigation measures of lockdowns or whatnot are only going to put out the big fire. It's like dropping a water tanker onto a raging wildfire. You'll slow down the fire, but you need boots on the ground of testing to put out the fire. And that's why you need a combination of both. And I believe potentially within a few months of, I say a month and a half, 2 months, once you slow down enough, you put in the aggressive testing, and then you could reopen business if these tests show that the epidemic is staying low.
We've seen different lockdowns enacted in different countries. What would be your ideal set of rules, and over what period of time? I appreciate it's just the first stage in mitigating. Testing is required as well, but just in terms of the lockdown.
But in terms of lockdown, first of all, I don't think we can ever do what China did. China's lockdowns were very draconian. People basically could not leave their homes other than to grocery shop. And even for some more aggressive places, the Chinese government brought the food to you instead of allowing you to leave the house to go to work or a grocery shop. So the lockdowns in the West are very, very lax compared to the lockdowns in China. I'm not saying which is right or not, but I believe the lockdowns have to be in place until the epidemic curve slows to sub-exponential, because all the curves right now in these major Western countries, plus the United States, are really exponential. We cannot have exponential increases. The lockdowns must be in place until the epidemic is at least linear and no longer exponential.
So in Wuhan, where it all began, we're seeing within 1 week, the lockdown will be lifted pretty much. Is that right? And what do you think of that?
I am hopeful, but I'm also concerned because this virus, we know it is extremely contagious. And I'm afraid of a risk of resurgence. In certain ways, the Chinese government just yesterday finally admitted that they've been suppressing the number of lab positive cases who are asymptomatic. And these asymptomatic, the US CDC says, are up to 25% of all cases. And so we know that even with the best test, even if the test is perfect, which it is not, you would only still be missing 25% of the cases floating around in a population. So that means when you lift these lockdowns, there is a chance for this resurgence to come back.
And a final question for you. You're in Washington, D.C., where a stay-at-home order has just been issued. Explain to me what that means. And also a second part to that question. 2 months ago, you came on the program and you said you were really worried about what was coming down the road for the United States. So it seems that your predictions have been borne out.
It's very worrisome. And, there's articles that mention that I was the first to predict it in mid-January. And, in some ways, it's very, very sad to see the state of affairs. In D.C., you know, several members of Congress have also tested positive, along with their staff members. And at the same time, a lot of people here on Capitol Hill have not been very careful, and that's why the epidemic is growing. Aside from New York, the D.C. metro area is the fastest growing epidemic in the United States, and that just worries me to no end. And the restrictions, the lockdowns, are very loosey-goosey. They have an enormous amount of exceptions for anywhere from caretakers. You can go to the park. It's a very lackadaisical kind of lockdown, and this is why I'm not hopeful until we have a nationwide lockdown. I tell it this way: United States has 50 states. We're plugging 30 holes in these 50 states. But as long as we have states that have very limited lockdown or restrictions, the ship will continue to sink if we still have additional 20 holes, because the U.S. is a very porous country between states. And that's why I'm very concerned that the U.S. is not keeping this epidemic contained well.
Dr. Fagel-Ding, thank you once again for joining us here on the Nexus. I really appreciate it. And thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can see all our previous coronavirus episodes on our channel on YouTube. But until next week, goodbye.